fact, the CIA officer who studied Putin for decades said that they have it on good authority that he tried to get into this department of illegals within the KGB and failed the language test.
So, Calder, you've written this fantastic article in the Sunday Times. It's titled Why Putin Isn't the Spy Master That He Claims to Be. For our viewers, could you just explain a little bit more about Putin's background in the KGB?
Yes. So Putin, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. And I wrote the piece really to try to correct the narrative that Putin has been primarily responsible for getting out there to say that he's this this masterful spy, and that we know he had a career in the KGB in the 1980s. So he joined when he was young. He first actually tried to join when he was too young, got sent to go away, go to university and come back. So, as he says, he loves the idea of spy novels and so on, right from an early age. And within this narrative that then the Kremlin has peddled since he got into power at the end of the century, in the year 2000, is that he had this incredible spy career within the KGB. Actually, he scratched the surface and not so much. He was stationed in East Germany, but not in the place where most of the spying activity took place, which was in Berlin. That's where the East-West spy conflict in the late stages of the Cold War, that's where all the action was. He was to the south in Dresden. And by most accounts, all accounts, I'd say, he was doing pretty humdrum work, clerical work. He has suggested in this kind of typical way of putting out there little sort of few breadcrumbs that he worked with Russian deep cover illegals. So these are people that are like in the TV series The Americans, living under false identities, aliases, or legends, as it's called, living in the West, and they're intelligence operatives or officers, blending into the societies. So he suggested he worked with them in East Germany, and he's even suggested that he was an illegal. Not so much. According to an exclusive interview I had with a CIA officer when I was writing my new book, the articles are a sort of really a synthesis of some of the conclusions of the book. In fact, the CIA officer who studied Putin for decades said that they have it on good authority that he tried to get into this department of illegals within the KGB and failed the language test. So this is the beginning, I would say, of when he has looked upon the deep cover illegals as the epitome of Russian intelligence, primarily, I think, because we can now say did not get into that department. So that was just sort of that's the background. And then if you actually look at his time in power, as it has gone from an authoritarian rule at the beginning of the 2000s through to now a dictatorship, there's been a succession of intelligence failures that he's presided over. So Russia, and Putin in particular, far from being this masterful spy master, not so much when you look at these succession of failures under his watch.
And it's interesting because when I talk to people about kind of Putin's beginnings, and many people say that he's really obsessed with the idea of the USSR and growing up in that, and really wants to see it. He thinks it's a huge failure of Russia that they don't have that amount of territory anymore. But you're kind of outlining that he has somewhat of an obsession with, being a spy master or the KGB. Like he's kind of obsessed with it.
He is obsessed with it. I think it's fair to say. I mean, we should say that it's very difficult to get into Putin's mind, but this is all sort of inference that we can draw from what he said and also interviews with people that have known him. But you're absolutely right that the two things go very closely together: the Soviet Union and his career as someone in the intelligence service. He witnessed, in his own words, he witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in his view, it was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. So he was stationed in Dresden, as I mentioned, as the Soviet Union began to crumble. Crowds surrounded the KGB office in station in Dresden, um, and he, in his own words, called the center, his headquarters, for backup, and the center was silent. And from that point on, in his mind, became this incredible betrayal of the part of reformers in Russia. So particularly Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, that Putin saw him from that point on as orchestrating this great betrayal of Mother Russia. And of course, Putin in the early 1990s was a nobody. He didn't have any idea he'd get into power, nor did anyone else. And in fact, people within the Russia's new intelligence services and the Kremlin said that they'd never even heard of Putin at that point. Apparently, we now know that he was moonlighting as a taxi driver at one point in, I think it was Moscow or St. Petersburg. So his career fell off a cliff after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But to everyone's surprise, his story in the early 1990s of working for the regional government in St. Petersburg brought him into close association with, and I would go further than say collaboration with, Russian organized crime, the mafia. And then, to everyone's surprise, Boris Yeltsin, the leader of Russia, made Putin the head of the Russian security service, the FSB, one of the two branches of the successor of the KGB. He was surprised by that. Everyone else was surprised by that. And at that point, I would say there's a fork in the road. Because at that point, then you have someone in the head of the FSB and also his links with Russian organized crime. And at that point, Russian intelligence and organized crime became blended. And then, to everyone's even greater surprise, Yeltsin chose Putin to be his successor in 1999. And at that point, his career obviously just went meteoric, absolutely to everyone's surprise. If you look at the British Foreign Office files from 1998 that have just been declassified about likely successors for Yeltsin, this is the 1998. Putin's name is nowhere on them. So it was a shot out of the blue, and we are all living with the consequences now of this in Putin's mind, this betrayal, particularly on the part of reformist elements in the Russian government, the United States, which he saw undermining the Soviet Union, and then NATO expansion in the 1990s has all come together. And within that mind frame, it makes sense what Putin has been doing about pushing back from what he sees as Western containment of Russia, that Russia is being frustrated by Western powers, while, as I said, combining the huge power of Russia's security service and intelligence services within Russia and their links with Russian organized crime. So it's a really, really noxious and ugly picture that emerges in the early 2000s.
And we see Putin, you kind of described how he's a lot more involved in the FSB in covert intelligence than most other global leaders are.
Yeah.
In a way you wouldn't expect Biden or Rishi Sunak to be. I mean, does that kind of derive from his obsession with this?
I think it derives, you're absolutely right. I think it derives from his past experience. I think that what we find is then also historically, there's a huge difference between the way leaders in liberal democracies use their intelligence agencies and those in authoritarian regimes. It's historically much more common for an autocratic or dictatorial leader to essentially micromanage intelligence agencies, because after all, both the leader and the agencies themselves, everyone knows that their duty is to give intelligence that doesn't challenge, doesn't in any way contradict what the leader is saying or wants to believe. That would be a sure way, under the Stalin period, early in the 20th century, and then now under Putin. If you disagree, that's a sure way to perhaps end up dead. So what do the agencies do? They provide what one FSB defector has told me is called within the service as loyal information or patriotic information. So this is exactly, you can't overestimate the difference and how different that is in from Western services, where their duty, be it here in Britain or in the US, is to provide intelligence, tell truth to power, to try to tell the leader the truth as they see it. And that might be very uncomfortable at times. Yes, there's been catastrophic moments when that's gone wrong, when that hasn't happened, Iraq, WMD, and so on. But those are failures of the system. They're not the system. So so to answer your question, Putin gets involved in micromanaging intelligence essentially because of the nature of his regime. And the echoes here, as a historian looking at this, the echoes with Stalin and how he abused his intelligence agencies to fulfill his grand strategic aims, murdering his opponents, and cherry picking intelligence that he thought was right. The echoes are just striking with Putin today.
And you've also you outlined there a little bit earlier about how Putin, when he became in charge of the FSB, there were a lot more links to organized crime and carrying things out for Russian oligarchs. And Putin really likes to portray the security service as, this elite group.
That's right.
But you've kind of said in your article it's a bit more, that's kind of just propaganda on his part.
Yeah, not even a bit more. That is straight propaganda, I'd say. So absolutely, at that point in 1998, as I mentioned, when he became FSB, head of the FSB, having previously been in the regional government, deputy mayor at one point, I believe, in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was then known as the gangland of Russia. So this is the home of Russian organized crime. And this was a moment, of course, of shock capitalism brought to Russia, where corruption just abounded, the Wild East, as it was known. And he, from that point on, combined organized crime and intelligence. And this is one thing that I tried to say in the article that I think is really important for your listeners, the audience, to appreciate. You often hear about this, about how in the clandestine struggle between East and West, spy agencies are doing similar things, and it's MI6 versus the old KGB, so on and so on. The FSB exists as a instrument of organized crime for the Russian government and for Putin in particular. It exists to facilitate massive money laundering schemes and corruption. So again, I've interviewed some defectors from the FSB, and they said, well, that they're one who worked in the economic security division. He said that's a complete misnomer. There's no economic security. This is about facilitating money laundering. And it's not just a question of a few bad apples. It's that all of the apples are bad. And that actually, if you're in that and you're not on the take, you're not corrupt, you stand out as someone really weird and potentially a mole from another service. So this is all geared towards the personal enrichment of the Russian oligarchs and Putin himself. The FSB has officers. This is all before the war in Ukraine, and I don't have any current information about what the FSB is doing with the Russian economy at the moment. But it's really important to appreciate that the FSB has officers stationed in major Russian banks and financial services. So this would be like the FBI in the US having officers in the Bank of America, or the MI5 having. I mean, it's a complete. And what are they doing there? What they're doing is helping to conduct massive, as I said, state run corruption. So if you want to think about Putin's rule, he wants you to think of it as a strong Russian nationalism, sort of harking back to a proud, heroic time in a mythical past. I think you really want to think of it in two ways. You want to think of it as a mafia state, and really more like a mafia syndicate. That is the way to understand Putin and how he runs all the organs of his regime, including the intelligence services. So rather uncomfortable, I'm afraid, but that's the reality when you speak to people who are defectors from the services.
And the whole point of covert operations is for them to be covert, and yet we keep hearing stories of these coming to light, especially in the last 20 years, during his rule.
Yeah.
And we recently learned of 3 Bulgarians. They were detained here in Britain, and they're accused of working for the Russian security service.
Yeah.
If those accusations end up being true, how bad is it for Putin?
Well, I think that this case, if they are true, and it's important to stress that if we just don't know because it's under it's at court at the moment, so we need to wait to see what happens. But let's say that this is true and they are operatives of the Russian government. Their discovery, it seems to me, would be the latest in a succession of failures. And it would be another humiliation for Putin. You're quite right that many of the intelligence operations that he's authorized have been discovered. One of the earliest humiliations for him was the discovery in 2010 of a group of deep cover illegals, the people that he regards as the elite, operating in the United States. This was a humiliation for him. The assassination here in Britain, attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal, a spy, a Russian spy who worked in the military intelligence service for MI. He was an agent recruited by MI6 in Russia's military intelligence. As we all remember, in 2018, Russian operatives tried to assassinate him using that weapons-grade nerve agent Novichok. It was exposed through the work of outstanding investigative reporters Bellingcat and others. So that's another humiliation. And then in the research for my book, I discovered that in 2020, Russia's intelligence services were planning an assassination on late stage planning on US soil, which was a huge break with the past, because in the Cold War and up to then, the Kremlin had not authorized, at least not that we know of, assassinations on US soil, and Putin was attempting to do that, but yet again it was discovered. The one area I would say that we still just don't know the answer to is there's been a succession of failures of Putin, the biggest one being, of course, his gamble to invade Ukraine. But the one area that we still don't know the answer to, and it could be the ace that he has up his sleeve, is Putin's relationship with Donald J. Trump. So the Mueller report that you may remember investigated all of this about election meddling. But what the Mueller report didn't do was to investigate the counterintelligence aspects, which is to say whether Putin has compromising material, or perhaps Trump is financially indebted to Russian oligarchs. Mueller report didn't investigate any of that. And that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been, it may have been investigated, but it's never been publicized. So what is the nature of Putin's relationship with Trump? We listeners might remember that at that extraordinary press conference in Helsinki in 2018, where a reporter asked Putin and Trump, they were standing together, they said, what do you think of the allegation of election meddling. And Trump said, well, I've just asked Putin, and he says it wasn't him, and I have no reason to doubt him. So in other words, Trump took the side of Putin over his own intelligence community. There's something very strange about Putin's embrace, of Trump's embrace of Putin. So that's a long way of saying we still don't really know if Putin has any leverage over Trump, and if Trump, who I'm entirely confident is going to be the Republican nomination in the 2024 election, if he somehow becomes president again, well, he's already said what he's going to do, by the way, which is he's going to cut off aid to Zelensky in order to force Zelensky to the negotiation table. And in my view, those terms of that negotiation and that peace settlement in Ukraine will favor, under Donald J. Trump, will favor Putin. It will not favor Zelensky. Of course, Trump, in his first indictment as president, that arose by his attempt to blackmail Zelensky. It seems like distant past now, but we forget it. But that's what he was actively promoting Russian talking points and attempting to blackmail Zelensky. So I fear that although Putin has overseen a succession of security and intelligence failures for the Russian government, the worst being his gamble to invade Ukraine, he may indeed have one ace up his sleeve, which is his relationship with Trump.
Again, we've had these, three people accused of being Russian security operatives. We know what happened in the 2016, election, that there was Russian interference. And then today, this isn't to do with Russia, but the Times has exclusive investigation about there was a Chinese spy using LinkedIn to hunt UK secrets. And I mean, what would you recommend the West do to prevent this? I mean, what should the United States be doing as it looks ahead to the 2024 election to make it, as fair and accurate as possible? And the same here in Britain as we look ahead to another general election.
So the LinkedIn is the new, it seems to me it's quite clear by now, and this is a great story by the Times, and it confirms what a lot of people have been whispering up until this point. So it's really a wonderful story to have it confirmed. But LinkedIn is the new battleground for intelligence services, and it was facilitated, I think it's safe to say, during COVID, when everything obviously moved online. And certainly the Chinese intelligence service, the Ministry of State Security, has been extraordinarily active over LinkedIn, as this story says. But they're far from alone. What is the best thing that we can do? Well, I actually go back to what it's. If you go back and have a look at the testimonies of Soviet defectors in the 1970s and 80s, one in particular who specialized in Russian Soviet disinformation. And he had a public testimony in Congress in the US. And they asked him, okay, what do we need to do to prevent this? How do we counter this? If we understand what the tricks that you use now, thanks to his testimony, what can we do to counter it? And his answer said, it's simple. It's read as widely as you can and do not believe things that you're reading. And this was in the be skeptical. Do not take things at face value. Don't, and I hate to say this sometimes, radio, don't just read one news source, but read many news sources. That was his answer. He said that is the best way to make yourself an informed citizen, and that's basically what it's all about. So if you get a request from a Chinese think tank offering you a free trip to China to give a lecture, I think one should definitely be very skeptical about that, because almost certainly in the background is the Ministry of State Security. Likewise, accepting social media news as facts, I think we just need to instill and this is really it seems to me a generational issue. Yes, it's about the upcoming general election here and the US election, but it's also longer term. And I say this as a father of a 6-year-old son who's starting school, and it's like you need to learn about digital literacy and how to actually understand and use data online, because that's the way of the future. I mean, that is the reality of now and will be in the future, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and I mean, you pointed to Soviet times, but it's arguably so much more difficult
Oh,
right
oh,
now in
oh.
the age of social media. But
No, it was that was like the age of innocence compared to this. This was, and that was when a few, you know, news editors at the big papers in either side of the Atlantic, at the Times and so on, could very much, they were the guardians of the public discourse of what was acceptable, what wasn't, and that social media and the new news mediums has just splintered all of that. So the principle is the same, I think. But and I actually asked, writing this book, I was fortunate enough to interview a defector from the the Czechoslovakian intelligence service during the Cold War, and he worked on his speciality was disinformation, and I interviewed him in 2018, and I said, well, how does this compare to what you were doing then? He was like, this is just, I would be in heaven if I was doing my old job now, because not only it's easier to spread disinformation, it's quicker to do so. He said, but also now there's just this incredible ability for people tendency for them to um, agree with nonsense and agree with things that can be proved to be false and just don't care. So he said from the perspective of, he called himself I was a professional peddler of lies, he said. And he said, if I was doing my old job now in this age of social media, it would be just like heaven. So that's to your point.
And Calder, we've not got much more time left, but I just wanted to ask you, I mean, critical thinking is a really difficult skill. And, if you're someone that, maybe isn't that good at that,
Yeah.
and, you're on Facebook in the run up to
Yeah.
the election and you're getting loads of disinformation, I mean, you can't blame individuals really for falling. It's very
No.
easy to fall for it. You could argue that, Americans may have learned their lesson from the last election, but not all of them, would have done, or not all of them are aware of kind of, what happened.
Yeah.
And so should the onus not be on the government or on these social media agencies? Should after this investigation came out, should LinkedIn not be doing more, or
Yeah.
what should Zuckerberg be doing?
I,
How is it?
I,
Who is the responsibility on?
it's a massive question, but the direction your question is getting is, should social media platforms be regulated? I think absolutely yes. I think that I just don't see how they can make the argument that they're not publishers anymore. They are publishers. So I think that there has to be, whether that means that then there's an editorial process. And the thing is, under Twitter now, under Elon Musk, I don't see that happening, because he's hard right, or at least hard free speech. But I think for me, maybe the way forward is to actually it's sort of to go back to the earlier, if you like, or encourage people to go back to trusted sources where there is an editorial process, the Times, or in the US, NPR, BBC. So where there is a trusted editorial process, that's where you look to get your news. That might just be wishful thinking on my part, in the age when younger people are busy and so on, and they just want to see the news feed on Facebook. I understand that. But ultimately, I think that we have got to try to regulate social media companies, because otherwise it's just a free-for-all for the spread of disinformation.
Calder, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating conversation, and just thank you for being here. This was amazing. I could chat to you all day about this.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you as well to our viewers for watching this today. And as Calder was saying, the best way to support our journalism and to help you stay informed is by reading the Times and the Sunday Times. And you can go to times.radio/subscribe to read incredible articles like the one from Calder that we've discussed today. Thank you.